G'day, Ainsley here. You have tuned into episode 15 of More Cowbell, Please. This week, Chris Stevens. Chris Stevens had a really unusual start in a music career. He started out programming sounds for a game company. Did that for 10 years before he even started producing records. Some of his first songs that he produced were TobyMac's song called Gone and a hit for Sanctus called I'm Not Alright. He gets into the backstories on those, and we move on to all kinds of stuff like the thrill of winning a Grammy and his memories of the late Mandisa. Now, if you've been listening on Spotify, Apple, or some of the other podcast platforms, I would love it if you'd also subscribe to YouTube. It'd be super helpful if you would. Next week, we will do part 2 of Chris Stevens. He has so many great stories that you're going to want to hear. Don't forget to subscribe. All right, let's get into it. This is Chris Stevens.
You know what this reminds me of? My wife and I hiked in the Dolomites last summer in Italy, and there's cows just wandering around. You know, you're way up at the top of a mountain. You think you're like climbing Mount Everest, and then you turn a corner and there's like a dozen cows walking around in a field, and they all have cowbells. You can hear them for like miles.
That's amazing. I'll relieve you of my instrument.
It was kind of my security blanket, but that's fine. You can take it.
Well, I don't want you to feel too secure. I'm going to make you feel insecure. That's where we're going.
Bring it. Bring it.
Should. I can't compete on a humor level, so I'll just try and make you feel uncomfortable instead. That'll work.
That works pretty well.
I can't believe you're in my studio, man. I mean, this is a great thing.
It is a great thing.
Let's explore this together and get into it.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Let's start with story stuff, because I don't know anything about you except I think Northwest is your
Oregon.
origins.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Tell me from childhood, what got you into music? What made you even think that was your path?
See, I was born into a very musical family. I was the youngest of 6 kids. My dad was a great singer. Maybe I inherited some of that. I don't know. But from a very early age, I was attracted to music. It was just something that was in my blood from day one. Even as a toddler and probably in diapers, I was singing the Star Spangled Banner and, whatever songs I learned at the time. But, and then my parents bought me a little Magnus organ. It was like an air pump. It was like had a fan in it that drove these little valves, and you could push the different chords down. And it came with a book that had, all these songs like Autumn Leaves and all these standard songs. And I learned how to play the melody in the right hand and hit the right chord in the left hand. It was like a brown plastic organ that was probably about 2 feet wide. I think the fan noise was louder than the actual tones that came out of it, but that's where I kind of cut my teeth, I guess, on an instrument. And then from there, it just kept spiraling. And my siblings were very, very involved in shaping my musical palette without even knowing it. I think they played music constantly, 8-track cassettes back then, or records. And so, there was always music going on in the house. Yeah, well, so I grew up in the 70s and 80s. That was my youth years. There was so much great music that came out of that era. And my siblings just loved listening to the radio, and they loved all the typical, the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac. And of course, anything that had to do with disco and funk and R&B music, they played a ton of that stuff. It just got into my pores, really. To this day, it's one of the driving influencers of anything I do creatively, musically, is music from that era. The melodies, the chords, all of it, even the production. I don't know, something about it is magical for me. That was a big part of my shaping my sound, I guess, was that era. And I still bring it with me today. That was kind of the early years. I played in band in school and sang in the choir and all that. I even played in a rock band when I was 18. I'm from Eugene, Oregon, so we kind of toured around in that area. And I kind of just thought, I'm not going to be able to do this for a living. I was practical in that regard. I didn't have any confidence. I had quite a few friends that were doing music for a living, or at least a big part of their living, and they struggled, and I didn't want to struggle financially, so I kind of just hung it up, went to school, tried to get a degree in electronics engineering, and I had no passion for it at all, but I thought, well, maybe I could work for Korg or Roland or Yamaha or one of those keyboard manufacturers and kind of get in the mix a little bit, but maybe be on the technology side of it. But then I got this job offer that a good friend of mine, Don Latarski, recommended, a guy that I collaborated with a lot. He was doing music for computer games, like as a contractor or whatever, in my hometown. This company called Dynamics, and he referred me for this internship that they were hiring somebody. They just kind of wanted to bring somebody on for like a summer internship, and it worked out great because I had just gotten married. Here I was 22 years old, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life still. Halfway through a 2-year degree, I was like, I'm just going to get an associate's degree. And I'm halfway into that, and I get this job, and it turns into a full-time, they offered me a great salary by the end of the summer, and I passed their test, and I learned so much in that job. The guy that hired me, Alan McKeon, was way ahead of the curve as far as music technology. He knew all about all the file formats, AIFF, WAV files, and bit depths, and sample rates, and all that stuff. Before, really, it was that common. This was early 90s. It was really just starting to become computer-based recording was really starting to take off.
So what were you actually doing? What was the job?
Initially, I was creating sound effects. They would give me a list of sound effects they needed for these games. Gun noises or, explosions and that sort of thing. Pretty quickly, though, I mentioned that I was into music and I could make the music tracks as well. They were hiring that out. When they realized I could do that, I started doing a lot. Looking back, it was kind of silly in a way. It was a good season for me to really learn. What's silly about it was that back then, the audio side of PC games was primarily PC games. We did a few like Sega or whatever the earlier consoles were, but it was mostly PC titles. You had like 3 options of sound quality. You had the internal speaker of a tower computer that was literally sine waves, bleeps and blips. Terrible.
Little, like a 2-inch
a little tiny
3-inch
speaker that went beep. And you could change the pitch, but that was about it. So you could go, but you couldn't make anything that sounded like, an explosion or something like that. So you would just kind of mimic a sound with the pitch of it.
Right.
And then they had what was called the Sound Blaster at the time, which was a card you could put in the PC. Now, if you're familiar with synthesizers, kind of like a stripped down Yamaha DX7, it had 2 operators. The DX7s have, I think, 6. This had 2 operators, which is like an oscillator. It's a tone generator. And that was a really crude synthesizer that could at least create something that resembled white noise. And
I'd like to pretend that I'm too young to know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so that was the next level up. And then the top level was the Roland MT32 sound module. That just became something that the game community embraced as a piece of hardware that could be attached easily, not that easily, to a computer. You had to have a MIDI interface, so you had to spend some money. Desktop module, and it was really just what they called a general MIDI sound module. It had a select bank of 128 sounds that were common at the time, but you could go in and create your own. You could override those sounds and create your own. And so I was like a mad scientist, even when I was 13 or 14. My dad bought me this synthesizer, and I was just up in the attic of our house, like just moving the sliders and for hours and hours. I loved making weird sound effects.
What synth did he buy you?
It was a Moog MG1 that was repackaged by Radio Shack as a realistic. That was my first synthesizer. I was probably 13, and I found it. I was half off at Radio Shack. I rode my bike down there one day, and I had to have it. I was in love. Like, I could not stop messing around with that thing. My dad worked at the railroad. He didn't have any money. Raising 6 kids. We never felt poor. My parents were really, really great about that, but I know that money was always tight. I think he knew that I had a passion for this might end up turning into something bigger, and he bought it for me. So getting back to the game thing, I think that what's funny is that we spent most of our time and energy, or I did anyways, making these sound effects and music for this higher end unit. And I come to find out years later that was like 1% of the gamers out there had those. So if you had one of those, you had really amazing sound quality. And we were making soundtracks that sounded almost like they were recorded in the studio, but with this synthesizer. I would spend hours just tweaking the sounds, and that was the game thing. And that lasted about 10 years, honestly. I ended up working for myself. I started my own company and contracted for a lot of these game companies. I did it with a friend of mine, Tim Clark, kind of in the latter part of the 90s. I never really was like emotionally connected to the game industry. It was just a way for me to make music, and it was a great living. It's what really pulled me back into music as a career. So I'm really thankful for it. But I was never a gamer. So I would make these sound effects and these music tracks for whatever the producer wanted. They would give me a list for things like cut scenes, where if you go through a certain part of the game, you trigger something and it goes to a little, what's called a cut scene. And there's music for that and animation and that sort of thing. I did those. A lot of times I would just turn in the music and I wouldn't even play the game. I never even see the final product. So I really didn't have like a driving need to do that. So I started looking for people to produce, because by the end of the 90s I had a studio and, again, for the game stuff, but I wanted to make records from day one, really. So I started finding artists to produce. A couple of those got the attention of some people in Nashville, and next thing you know, I'm coming out here and meeting people, and it all kind of happened pretty quickly, probably around 2002. Within, I'd say 2 years, maybe 3, I moved here with 4 kids.
So I met you at what was People's Church. Jolie brought you up and said, hey, meet this guy, Chris Stevens.
Yeah.
And that must have been around that time. So
yeah, it was 05.
Really, you said you had some acts that labels had some interest in. Who were they? What happened with those?
Yeah. So one was Paul Wright. We met each other online and we just started kind of collaborating. He had a band called Front Row Joe, still a great friend to this day. His music attracted the attention of TobyMac. He sent the EP we did to Toby. And Toby really liked it. Paul ended up getting a record deal with Goatee Records, so he signed with Goatee. At the same time, I was working with Shawn Macdonald, who was a good friend of Paul's. So Paul introduced me to Shawn. Shawn got a record deal from Capitol Christian. Through that, I got to know a lot of the people at Capitol CMG. So it was really kind of two things were happening at the same time. Toby was working on his second solo album, and he started coming out to Oregon, writing and working with Paul and I just kind of hit it off with Toby, creatively and personally, and formed a great friendship pretty quickly, and that's really what ultimately led me to moving here.
So he's flying out and he's working with you on his music or Paul's or both?
Well, kind of both. Pretty quickly transitioned into Toby's stuff, because he was kind of in the middle of working on a new album, and I think he was just fishing, looking for new sounds and new,
At what point do you have a hit or you have something that really breaks out and changes the game for you? Is that a long way down or pretty quickly?
I had some success a little bit with Toby before I moved. So when I moved here, I think he had a song. This is actually kind of funny. I had all these game cues, all the gaming years, tons of them. And so he and I were sitting in my studio out in Oregon. This is before I moved here, listening to all these 30-second cues. I don't even know what game they went in. It was like a baseball game or something, halftime music or something. So I had all these like rock and pop tracks, and they were just cues with a little musical hook, no lyrics or anything. And he's like, well, can you just play some of those things you played me earlier, those musical cues, and see if there's anything in there that we like, And we came across a cue that ended up becoming a single that he put out called Gone. When that song came out and it did really well at radio, that's kind of the first time I felt like I was kind of attached to something that was at that level.
Some traction.
Yeah, and that was before I moved here, or maybe really close to around the time I moved here. So I kind of had at least a taste of success before I moved here. That helped a lot. But I also had some failures. The first gig I had when I moved here was producing Audio Adrenaline. It did not go well.
Is that right?
I got myself fired pretty much.
Can you speak to the mistake that was made or the mistakes that were made? Tell me about that.
Well, I moved here in December of 2004. I think I was shell-shocked. I moved 2,500 miles or however far it is from Oregon. Never even been east of the Mississippi River, other than a trip or two here prior to moving. But I was a fish out of water, man. I remember getting really sick. I had a really bad sore throat, strep throat or something. It was in the dead of winter, and I was still getting my bearings. And I lived out here in Spring Hill. I got fired pretty quickly because, so what happened is they set me up with Audio Adrenaline to go in a studio in downtown Nashville. I was just in over my head. I'd only worked in my bedroom with a mic and a laptop, whatever. I didn't have experience working in a big studio. I'd had a little bit, and they were going through some things too, as a band at the time. Mark was having some vocal issues, of course, and there was some tension a little bit. I wasn't a great shepherd of that. I was pretty naive and pretty green, and I didn't really know what I was doing. They were wasting their money on studio time, and I was not doing a great job of motivating and getting the band all on the same page and sort of doing what a producer does sometimes, which is encourage and motivate. I didn't really have that skill. It ended up being that after a couple of sessions of that, we had a heart-to-heart conversation, and there really wasn't any resolution from it other than, we need to kind of figure out what we're doing. And the phone went silent, and then I found out a few weeks later that they'd taken it up with, anyway. They ended up whatever that album was. It was I produced one or two songs on it, but that we'd kind of gotten down the road a little ways with. But I love all those guys dearly too. I don't really keep in touch with them much, but we all ended on great terms. I mean, there was zero bitterness whatsoever, and I learned a lot in that. Obviously, I felt bad that I wasted their time. We all have those stories. So.
Oh, absolutely.
Shortly after that whole thing, within a couple months, I was starting to work with Sanctus Real. We really connected. And by that time, I'd started kind of figuring out the lay of the land here, and I was a little bit more focused. We worked on some songs together, and I ended up producing their album. We had a song called I'm Not All Right that we wrote, and I produced it. They had a lot of success with it, and it was a good recovery. From there, I think things kind of started clicking. I mean, there's a few instances with that band where we had the personal matters that got involved. I wouldn't say got in the way. They inspired things and writing, and like we all deal with stuff, and you can't just tune that out. It becomes part of the process, Essential. I know Mark, the drummer, he lost his dad to cancer, and I know that was going on right then. And I think that had an influence on that song in particular. Because the original lyric for that song was I'll be fine as long as we keep faith and hope alive. I think that was the original lyric. And through writing and being honest with each other and a couple of sessions, we came to the conclusion that was not true. It was I'm not all right. I'm broken inside. It didn't even really have a resolution. I mean, it does in the song, the lyric, but it also just sits there for a minute and it says, I'm not all right. Mm. And then Matt, he had, his son was born with a congenital heart issue, and there was a lot of stuff around that, in one of the albums we worked on later. So, yeah, there was some heavy stuff for sure.
You've won 5 Grammys. I mean, those stories, you've got a bunch of. Where did those Grammys come from?
The stories start fading, though. That's the problem.
Well, that's why I want to spark them.
Well, the really cool thing about the Grammys was it's never something I would ever want to take for granted, that a lot of people work really hard to get a Grammy, and many don't, and definitely deserve it. I will say that for me, it's not a life-changing thing. That doesn't mean I'm not grateful, that it's not something that's really cool to share with family. And, my family loves that. Say they've got a relative that's a Grammy winner or whatever. It's fun for them, and I love it. But an interesting thing is, and I'm not a really superstitious person, but obviously I'm a spiritual guy, and so I had a few close calls, with Grammys nominations and nail-biting, moments where it didn't go our way, and so I think there was a point where I kind of felt like that may not be in my future, a Grammy, and I think a lot of us go through that, and I was okay with it, but I was also a little disappointed. My father died in November of 2012. He didn't have a long illness. It was about a month or so. Went pretty quickly, and it was a really difficult thing. I was really close to my dad, and he was a great role model. And 2 months later, my mom actually came to the Grammys with me, and that was in 2013. It was a big trip for her. They were married 62 years, so it was like a really hard trip for her. But she wanted to be there, and that's when I won my first Grammy, and it was for Toby. It was really special. And then I won 2 more the next year, and then I won another one 2 years later. It's almost like they just started falling out of the sky. So I like to think that Dad pulled some strings. I don't know. It's just cool. I mean, I wish he could have seen it, but I think he did.
That moment when they read the names,
yeah,
and then there's that big pause from the thing, and I mean, you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
And then when they finally read the name.
Yeah, the heart rate goes up to about 160. I think I was timing it. Yeah, about 160. Yeah, and you're like, am I gonna have a heart attack? Or yeah,
it's
there's
a surreal moment. I was
well,
there
if you're in your body like I am, you feel every sensation. So yeah, you are in the moment right there. You're like, for all the times that we space out and zone out on our phones and we are not in the moment, that's one of the times that you are in the moment.
I was there for when the thing was announced one time, and it was a surreal moment. It's like, you're in the moment. There's no way around it.
There's no way around it, and it's good for that. Not really a comfortable moment. I'm grateful for those things.
Well, for me, it felt like a big surprise because I was like, oh, they're not, that's not going to win. And then when it gets read out, it's like this adrenaline shot.
Yeah.
Boom.
Yeah. I'm super grateful for that, of course.
So were all the 5 Toby related, or?
No, the second 2 were Mandisa, her album and song, Overcomer, won that year in 2014. Of course, it's very heavy for me to even share that, with losing her last year. So I'm grateful that we had that experience together and that memory.
Can you tell me anything about that? Your relationship with her?
Well, that was one of those relationships that you look back on. You wish you had done some things differently. You wish you had gotten to know that person better. She was such a light, such a beautiful soul. And she had her own battles. She was very open about that. And I think people respected that, and people really benefited from it. People that were going through stuff could really relate to her because she was very open about her struggles. There's a ton of gratitude for having gotten to experience some things with her and some successes. And there's a little bit of sadness that at times, we both probably didn't lean into that relationship as much as we could have because we were both going through things. She had seasons in her life where she was really struggling with things, and I did too. I think we could have made a lot more music together. That's what I'm saying. And maybe even gotten to know each other on a deeper level. But our individual struggles kind of got in the way of that sometimes. But working with her was a joy. She was very much a strong contributor to everything she did. Musically, writing, she was just inspiring to work with. I just miss her.
Well, with that sobering end to this episode, I hope you'll hold your loved ones close. Don't take for granted any moment that they're with you. Make sure you subscribe so you won't miss any of the goodness with Chris Stevens' next episode and many of my other great guests coming up. Hey, I'd love to hear what you think about this episode and other ones, so make sure you leave a comment. Don't forget to subscribe at YouTube or wherever you listen. All right, until next week, make sure you put good things in your ear holes. Peace out.